Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this seminar about the pollution from filters. My name is Ingrid Talu, and I'm the chair of Teachers Against Tobacco. And here are also Björn Sundin on the board and Pia Thornberg. We've been planning this together. We are working together with professionals against tobacco, doctors, nurses, dentists, and psychologists against tobacco, and also together with think tank Tobaksfakta. So, we are so happy to have you here. And I met you about 5 years ago, and finally you're here. We have had connections. We have met in 2 world conferences. Right. And Professor Novotny, you have lots of experience of working with the pollution of tobacco butts. And you are at the San Diego State University and University of California. And you've been working for many years in tobacco control and research for many years. So, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
You have had a message.
Yes. Yes, please. We are video recording this lecture, and it would be convenient to have the questions after the lecture, so we can have the microphone and record it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay now with this microphone? I know we're recording this, so I have to speak into this device. Test out the sound here first. Is that good? All right, great. Thanks very much for inviting me, Ingrid, and for all of you to come and hear a little story about another aspect of tobacco control that I've been working on for the last several years. I started out as a family doctor in a small town. And when you're a clinician, you realize soon that you're on the tail end of health problems. You're there trying to clean up the already established harm. And it's somewhat frustrating, especially even just asking your patients to quit smoking. It's not very successful usually. But really what is important is to think if there's some way of getting upstream from that end result of lung cancer and pulmonary disease and heart disease. So I changed over to be a public health physician. I joined the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. And I worked in the government for about 23 years, and then I switched over to academia, where I can do some more independent research. And about 10 years ago, I set up a little NGO called the Cigarette Butt Pollution Project. There's one of our signs down there. This was a very purposeful sort of endeavor to bring environmental concerns and public health tobacco concerns together. So on the board, that advisory board for my NGO, I have environmentalists and also behavioralists, and also some people that are in policy-making positions with something called a Coastal Commission that takes care of our coastal environment in California. So I've been doing this for about 10 years, and it's an interesting field to explore, the environmental aspects of tobacco. We all know about the harms of tobacco. I mean, it's pretty clear from the get-go that we know it causes extraordinary health consequences. And in the U.S., we still have about 34 million smokers. It's a big country right there. So we haven't really won the battle at all. And it's still a significant battle here in Sweden, too. You have about 1 million smokers. And the mortality, that is the early deaths, that is what we would consider preventable deaths, is really significant in the United States. Almost 500,000 people a year. It's the single most important cause of premature mortality in the United States. Still, after decades of intervention. You have about 12,000 deaths per year here in Sweden. There's economic costs associated with this. Not surprisingly, it costs money to treat people with cancer and related diseases. It's extremely expensive. And, you know, that's not something to to ignore, because that has been the basis of policy concerns. When you talk about money, governments and policymakers listen to you. And so we were able to do this several years ago, trying to figure out what the economic cost of healthcare was. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic cost of the environment in a little while as well. But it's a substantial piece. It's about $9 billion here in Sweden. And the other big thing that I want to emphasize is that there's a lot of cigarettes that are produced globally. And this is something to think about when you think in terms of trillions. It's trillions of cigarettes. Almost 6 trillion cigarettes are produced every year. Where do they go after they're smoked? Here, there's about 7 billion in Sweden that I estimated. And many of these are dumped onto the streets. And this is where we start this conversation about what's the impact of tobacco on the environment. We also have been talking, the people that have been working on tobacco control for a while, the end game. We're close to being able to say we're winning this battle. Well, I've still got a lot of challenges. But in order to do that, we're going to have to do something different than what we've been doing. I mean, we can tell people to quit smoking, we can educate kids, we can raise the taxes, we can ban the advertising, we can do all sorts of things, but we're going to need more sort of creative, bold measures to really get to that end game, whatever it means in terms of the definition. One of those things I think is paying attention to the environmental aspects of this, because there's now a heightened an increased interest in the environment as an issue for all of us. Tobacco is really hard on the environment, starting with growing, where it's very hard on the soils. It uses a lot of pesticides, rodenticides. It involves child labor in excessive ways that we should be ashamed of. So it starts out on that left side, as one major component of environmental insult. Tobacco production is a dirty process. Even when you try to make cigarettes low tar, low nicotine, you're going to be producing chemicals that contaminate the environment. It's actually a very dirty and unregulated process. Cigarette transport adds to our carbon dioxide burdens. Cigarette consumption has an environmental component that is secondhand smoke. In the United States, and I think most places, that's the second most common cause of lung cancer. The first most common cause is smoking. The second one is secondhand smoke. The wives, the husbands, or exposed people, that's who gets lung cancer. It's not radon, it's not pesticides, it's not anything else, it's secondhand smoke. And then there's third-hand smoke. Has anybody heard that term before, third-hand smoke? Yeah, that's what's left over in buildings and housing, and especially multi-unit housing, or in cars where people have smoked. It doesn't go away. It gets embedded in the walls. You have to tear the walls out to really make it go away. And we've got actually a multi-campus center on third-hand smoke studies, where we can go into homes that have been free of smokers for a decade and wipe the surfaces and find the chemicals there. And whether these cause harm to humans, we're not sure, but what we do know is that babies or small children who are crawling around on the floors and putting their mouths on everything actually are exposed to these chemicals. We can measure that. We've actually found it on these surface wipes. So that's some serious environmental concern. But the one I'm going to talk about today is post-consumption waste, cigarette butts. And I'll tell you why. It seems like not a big deal. By the way, how many cigarette butts did you see out on the street today when you came in here? Anybody count them? The answer is a lot. And you're going to see more. Now, I'm sorry about this, but after I give this talk, everybody goes out and they start looking around and go, oh, geez, there's a lot of butts around the ground. And there are. And I'm using this term now, tobacco product waste, to label this as to what it really is. It's not litter. Litter is, kind of benign. It's waste. It's hazardous waste. So TPW, tobacco product waste. Why is it important? Well, it's the single most picked up item of waste in the world. That means by count, that if you count up every piece of stuff that's picked up in trash cleanups on the beaches or in urban environments, about a third is cigarette butts. It makes sense. I mean, you have 6 trillion cigarettes produced in the world. Many of them are going to end up in the environment, on streets or on the beaches or whatever. So that's more than food wrappers or straws or beverage bottles or anything else, in terms of single-use plastics. And that's an important thing to start to think about, because there is something called the EU Single-Use Plastics Directive, which has been developed very recently and doesn't include cigarette butts. Why is that important? Well, we'll see in a minute. Now, the important thing is to note is that this epidemic is actually increasing. That is, the epidemic of tobacco product production. And cigarettes, are mostly filtered. They're mostly more than 90%, globally. In the United States, it's more than 99% of the cigarettes are made with the plastic filter, cellulose acetate-based plastic filters. And that's a plastic, it's a single-use plastic. So try to get that, again, thinking about it. But here's the global production up into 2020. It continues to grow mostly because of the expanded markets in China and India and, low and middle income countries. So again, we may be winning some battles in the US and Sweden and England and a few other places, but there's a bunch of cigarettes still produced around the world. And, the question is, are these harmful to our pets or to our kids or to the environment in general? And are there any health effects to this cigarette butt waste out there in the world? There might be, and I'll try to give you a reason for that. Because, well, for one thing, we can measure a little bit just by estimating the weight of cigarette butt waste from the number of cigarettes that are produced. And this is, probably a conservative estimate, but about 50 million kilograms in the United States, and here it's about 600,000 kilograms here in Sweden, I think. Again, I kind of did this on the back of an envelope, so you can quote me, but don't say that it's carefully done science. But this doesn't include all the other junk, the waste, the packages, the wrappings, the stuff that comes out of it, or the snus pouches, which I now see all over the streets too. They're there, and I think that they're made of plastic as well. I think that because if they weren't something durable, they would melt in the mouth and not on the street. And also e-cigarettes, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's a whole separate category of waste, which is electronic. E-cigarettes contain lithium-ion batteries, heavy metals, nicotine, which of course is the juice that's in them that is a toxic substance in and of itself. So there's a bunch, and we might be able to see this. There was several studies that were done that looked at what is leached out of the cigarette butts in water when you dump them in water, and measure things like heavy metals and things that might be contaminating the bottom of the aquatic biomes. And what has been reported is some animals have consumed these things, turtles and pets. We actually have animal poison control centers in the United States that report on what animals get poisoned with, pets and wildlife and other things. And we were able to ascertain that there were thousands of cases of cigarette butt consumption by animals and also by humans, even little kids, because they're indiscriminate eaters. And it was, there's been publications and thousands of cases where kids have actually gone into the emergency room, had to be treated. It's not like, a huge epidemic, but it is possible that these things become objects of consumption. And they're, toxic to small animals at the bottom of the food chain, microorganisms. And they are not just potentially toxic waste products, but they're a nuisance. We go to the beach and we don't expect to be putting our hands in the sand and coming up with cigarette butts, but we do. And even in the beaches in California, where we have a lot of restrictions, most towns along the coast ban smoking on the beach, but it's not enforced, and that's a big challenge for this issue. But there are costs associated with this. The people who clean up butts are communities or voluntary groups, or yourselves probably, or kids or other people that do this. And that would be considered an economic externality. What that means is that the people who produce the product and the people who use the product are not taking responsibility for the cleanup of the product. It's externalized from them. And that's where costs and the consideration of, changing the way cigarette butts are treated may start to come in. So we were curious about this toxicity issue. And there's a methodology that is used by businesses to prove that they are not polluting the environment. It's an Environmental Protection Agency protocol that uses test fish, very carefully controlled fish species with oxygenation and food and other kinds of things that make this a valid scientific evaluation of waste products or chemicals or things that are dumped into the environment during a manufacturing process. So companies have to document what they do and prove that it's not toxic. So we use the same method to document whether or not cigarette butts are toxic. And this is into the water aquatic biome. And so we used samples of fish of both saltwater and freshwater, top smelt and fathead minnows. These are tiny little fish. And what we did was we soaked cigarette butts in water. This is the way you do this study. It's a kind of a standardized approach to get a dilution of how many butts in a liter of water will be harmful to the fish. And you do this with the endpoint of killing half the fish. And yes, we had to get institutional review approval for this study because we were killing fish. And I hesitate to say that to kids that I speak to, but we did. And the cigarette butts were soaked for 96 hours, 4 days. Again, this is a standard kind of level of exposure. And we measured when the concentration was lethal to the fish at 50% of the fish dying. That is something called the lethal dose 50. And this is the result. What it says here is with 1 cigarette butt and a liter of water, it kills half the fish. And that's both freshwater and saltwater fish. So that classifies this as an aquatic toxin where we'll never get 1 cigarette butt in every liter of water that we measure. And we don't have to show that this actually does kill all the fish that are exposed to it. But what we do show is that this has what we would classify as toxic hazardous waste. The chemicals are there. The chemicals, they have been identified. Mostly it's nicotine. Ethylphenol and heavy metals also contribute, but the nicotine is probably the most toxic substance. We filmed these fish that were exposed to it on an acute basis and showed them to turn over on their backs, have seizures, and throw up, which are signs of nicotine poisoning. Not only was it the smoked cigarette butt, and by the way, these are not butts we got off the street. These were machine-smoked, standardized cigarettes that were not contaminated with bacteria or anything else. So there was it was again a controlled experiment. But even the cigarette butts that had no remnant tobacco, that is, there's always a little bit of tobacco at the end, killed this fish at 4 cigarette butts per liter. And even the filter that was unsmoked killed this fish at 8 cigarette butts per liter. So there's a pretty good evidence that there's toxicity here. And does this cause problems? Again, it's pretty hard to measure this in a sort of wide environmental basis, but this picture is actually real. This is not staged. This was done by an ornithologist, a person who was studying this bird. It was a black skimmer in Florida a couple of months ago, and got a picture of it feeding a cigarette butt to its chick. Birds have been known to put these cigarette butts in their nest because it's a nest building material, and it actually cuts down on the ectoparasites that the birds have on them. I mean, it's a pesticide. Nicotine is a pesticide. So that's not surprising, but what it does to the bird, we don't know. But what we also start to think about, when we have an environmental contamination of, possibly significance, other sublethal effects, that is, things that don't kill you, like estrogenicity, tumorigenicity, things that get absorbed into the food chain that may actually then affect people. And I don't mean to be alarmist about this, but we can measure antibiotics, opioids, pesticides, things like that in our drinking water supplies that don't get treated out, you know. We're looking at this now to see whether or not these chemicals from cigarette butts can be identified in like stormwater drainage or drinking water systems or on beaches in the sand and things like that. They have been, you know, measured in alongside roadsides actually, where a lot of cigarette butts get dumped. They may accumulate then into the food chain and bioamplify. That is, as they start out in the food chain, they multiply their effects. What happens over time, when nicotine may age, it can form what's called tobacco-specific nitrosamines, which is a carcinogenic compound. So it's possible. So this is a biologic plausibility that we're talking about, and that there are pathways for human health risks that start with these things getting into, you know, water systems, into food, or rather recreational environments, and then up into, you know, some sort of human exposure. So that's worth thinking about. And when we start talking about this, we have to sort of invoke environmental principles. And the one environmental principle that is pretty significant is called a precautionary principle. And this really says that you don't have to show that there's significant human health effects when there's an environmental toxic exposure. If it's shown that this is a toxic substance and it is ending up in the environment and it is something that can cause harm, you don't have to show that there is harm in order to regulate it. So that's the precautionary principle. Well, what to do? So, you know, we all know what to do. Stop smoking, right? That's the simplest answer and the most difficult. But what you can do other than that, that helps perhaps accentuate the fact that cigarette butts and cigarette smoking causes harm, of course, but it causes environmental contamination and perhaps exposures that may be also harmful, but also that they cause an expense or an externality of cleanup costs to communities and voluntary groups. Well, there are regulatory laws, litter laws. I don't know what it is here in Sweden, but in California, you can be fined up to $1,000 for littering a cigarette. And as a matter of fact, a friend of mine he's a professor of epidemiology, the chairman of the department at the University of California, San Francisco. It says that he smoked a cigar, little small cigars, twice a year. And he said he was driving along the, and this is a true story, he was driving along the Berkeley Pier, Berkeley, California, in the Bay Area. And he didn't know what to do with his cigar because the Prius that he was driving, his wife's Prius, had no ashtray. So he flicked it out. But behind him, the Berkeley police were following him and cited him and fined him $500 and a day of community service to go out and clean up trash off the Berkeley Pier. And that doesn't happen very often. In California, this law with the litter fee, the littering fine, it's only been enforced about 150 times over the last 5 years. So it's not very common, but it is there as a piece of legislation. Environmental regulations could be used here as if these things are a toxic waste stream. It's a little hard to think about it, though, because, you know, when you start talking about environmental regulations that limit, you know, from pollution, you're usually talking about single sources, that is like a sewer or a factory that emits a bunch of toxic stuff. But in this case, it's non-point source pollution. It's all over the place. What we have in California, and again, I don't know what might happen here, but we have a regulation that is going to take effect by 2030 that says no item of trash larger than 5 millimeters can be allowed to go into our storm drains that then drain into the streams and rivers and the ocean. That would include cigarette butts. So right now, we're having this discussion in California about how we should try to prevent anything bigger than 5 millimeters from getting into the storm drains, because that's in accordance with our Clean Water Act. It's a law that has to be put into place. So how can you do that? Well, the idea is source reduction. Rather than just catching it and having full capture of the pollution, or having people go out and pick these things up, because picking them up, I mean, that slide I showed you about the international coastal cleanups, they get about 1 million cigarette butts a year globally on the single day that they do this. That's nothing. You know, when you got trillions. On our campus, you know, I did butt cleanups with my students. I had them go out every year on Earth Day, gave them extra credit for this, and pick up butts off of a 1 square mile campus for 1 hour with 50 students each time, so that I could have a consistent measurement over the years, 5 years. And each year, they picked up 20,000 butts in 1 square mile. And that's even 1 year after they went, the campus went smoke-free. It's gotten better since then, since they've now implemented a fine for any students caught smoking on campus. So it's an interesting phenomenon, you know, when you quantify the butt waste. It always, you know, amazes people, and it's really stinky, awful stuff when you collect 20,000 butts and you put them out in front of your office, and you know, it was pretty ugly. And in the United States, we also have another way of dealing with environmental contamination, and that's to sue the bastards. You know, this happens a lot. Environmental groups, this is what they do. Oftentimes, they bring lawsuits against polluters to get them to stop polluting. And is that possible with the industry? Well, maybe. We actually published an article in a law review that explored the ways that you can actually create liability against the industry. And the main principle is called public nuisance. That these companies create a public nuisance by manufacturing a product that is meant to be disposed of as it is. So maybe that could be a source of intervention. I'm not sure if it would work here, but you know, that it's commonly done in the U.S. And some lawyers are actually interested in this. Well, currently, you know, what goes on, besides the litter laws that I mentioned, there's a lot of public relations campaigns. There's several environmental groups, but also the Truth Initiative, which is based in Washington, has taken this on. The California Department of Health Services, Public Health Department, has taken on this issue and produced ads that have been played in movie theaters and on television to make, you know, create an alert to raise the awareness of this issue. So that's a major first step, is to get this knowledge gap that is there to be resolved. That is, people don't look at cigarette butts as a toxic hazardous waste product. They don't look at them as non-biodegradable plastic, single-use plastics. They look at them as the last acceptable form of litter. It's part of the ritual of smoking, and it's hardly ever brought back to responsibility to the industry. We can ban outdoor smoking, just as we did on our campus, and beaches and parks, for instance, or you know, places where public gathers. There's some communities in California. San Luis Obispo is a lovely little coastal community that bans smoking on its downtown streets, and you don't see any cigarette butts. People are smoking someplace, and they're dumping them someplace, but at least that raises the level of attention to this issue and challenges people to stop doing it. So that's an important piece, and you know, it's, again, the enforcement issues are difficult. We just passed a law 2 weeks ago to ban smoking on all state parks and beaches in California. It's great, except they had got lobbied by the tobacco industry, and there's a bunch of exceptions. For instance, you can have a religious exemption to smoke in the state parks and beaches. What does that mean? You know, I mean, is the park ranger is going to go up to somebody and say, you can't smoke, and he says, well, but it's my religion, I can smoke. You know, it's not going to be enforced. And the fine was reduced from $200 to $25, and that's not sufficient to deter people. So anyway, there's things like that happen in the political process. I mentioned the anti-litter laws, take back and recycling. Some people have proposed this, just as they have with all sorts of other polluting elements, things like mattresses or oil or tires or, you know, computer products, electronics, etc. And these can be taken back and recycled in many cases, but it's pretty hard to think about recycling toxic hazardous waste, plastics that are saturated with carcinogens and chemicals that you can't get rid of. There's a company called TerraCycle in New Jersey in the U.S. that has been trying to do something with this. They get money from the tobacco industry. Why? Because it absolves them of responsibility for this issue, transfers it to someplace else, and has no real effect on the quantity of cigarette butts produced. It's, like more of a greenwashing, I would call it. It's not acceptable because, what this company has been doing is asking people to send in their cigarette butts in the mail. So you got this smelly pile of toxic waste going in the mail. It doesn't make sense to me. And then there's something called litter fees, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. San Francisco actually passed a law, again, about 8 years ago. San Francisco passes a lot of really interesting legislation. They just banned the sale of e-cigarettes and succeeded in fending off a very strong challenge from the tobacco industry on that. But they put a litter fee of 20 cents a pack. I'll explain that to you in a little bit. But a litter fee is not a tax. It means that you take this fee and you use it to fund a program. That is cleanup, public relations, enforcement, whatever, research, and use it only for that, and it doesn't go into the general tax fund. We know that we've succeeded in getting people to quit smoking or not smoke in indoor environments, but then what do? They go outdoors. A lot of environmental groups have recognized this, and this, for instance, is a butt waste receptacle out on the beach. And all around it, you can't see them, but there's cigarette butts that are just sort of scattered around. This is a butt waste receptacle at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where I was for the last 2 months. It's just a mess. And this one is out in front of the World Bank where I used to work, and there's all sorts of cigarette butts around the outside of it. And if you go out on the waste receptacles on the street here, I was just looking around on them. There's a place to put your cigarette butt out, but all around the base of it, there's cigarette butts. And this is out in front of my hotel in Stockholm. Oops. Which was, there's several of these bollards that are up and down the street and all. I don't know, there's a little pouch in them. I guess people thought it was an ashtray. And I think there's a bunch of snooze pouches there too, but the cigarette butts are more easily seen. Outdoor smoking bans help to denormalize cigarette use or tobacco use in general. So I think that these are a good idea. And it gets people to realize that, it's not right to do this. And they're hard to enforce, but municipalities can do it, and they have. Communities prohibit smoking in parks and beaches, college campuses, and, it is something that I think has a lot of value in a more general sense than just even the butt waste perception. And these cleanups, they're not wrong. I mean, it's, they help really to raise the level of attention because, it's pretty impressive to see what comes out of these cleanup products. Social media is useful. The Truth Initiative did a bunch of social media interventions, and we did some studies using big data analysis to see if we could get people to start talking about cigarette butts as toxic waste. And by virtue of some public relations announcements and, YouTube things and some other, celebrity-led intervention, public information campaigns, we were able to see and detect increased conversations on YouTube, or rather on Instagram, and I don't do social media, but fortunately I had some students who did this, and they were able to measure the impacts of this. And so they work, and I mentioned the PR campaigns. I want to show you this picture because, oops, let me go back. Yeah, this picture, one of my students has engaged in a project to pick up all this tobacco waste off of school campuses. And these are campuses of kids 10 to 18 years of age, high school and middle school. And those are Juul pods. We have this epidemic of Juul use in the US. Now, 60% of the market for electronic cigarettes is this, it looks like a USB drive. You've seen these things, USB drive, and then the pod that goes onto it. And the interesting thing about this is that, you notice the color? that shows the flavors that kids are using. It's menthol and mint, and the yellow is mango. And so we can use this as a tool to monitor what the preferences are for Juul pod or Juul uses. But what's really impressive is that there's a lot of them on the on the campuses. They're being used in schools, even though there are restrictions on any kind of tobacco use. And what's really interesting is that it's mostly in the wealthier schools. In the less wealthy schools, there's more cigars and little, more standard tobacco products. Anyway, I want to introduce this principle. I hope I'm not putting you to sleep with all these principles, but this one's important. It's extended producer responsibility. And this is used, as I mentioned, for other kinds of polluting waste products, where the manufacturer is responsible, is called on to be responsible from the time the product is manufactured all the way down through the distribution process to the post-consumption post-consumer status. And that's important. That's an important principle, and it's more accepted here in Europe than it is in the U.S. In the U.S., we have very little sort of incentive on this, but it shifts the burden away from the taxpayers and communities back upstream to the tobacco industry. That's the idea, and that makes sense. It may cause the demand on the industry to do some things that they haven't been doing. For instance, to design or produce products that minimize environmental hazards. Now, the industry has tried to make biodegradable filters in the past. It didn't work because they couldn't market them. And so they relied on this cellulose acetate as their flagship for this filter design. But that's why I'm saying the design is get rid of it. And are they going to get rid of all cigarettes that way? No, you can still smoke unfiltered cigarettes, but you won't be having these plastic pieces scattered all over the place. And they already make unfiltered cigarettes. There's still several brands that do that. So it's not a new issue, it's an old issue. This is meant to promote a total life cycle approach to the product. This slide, I think, is informative about EPR. It calls on companies to have several different sources of financial responsibility. Informative, meaning they have to inform people about the hazardous waste. Should there be a label on tobacco products that said this is toxic hazardous waste, don't dispose of it in the environment? Financial responsibility. It shifts cleanup costs to them. Or, like the litter fee, for instance, would be a shift of responsibility by virtue of adding to the price of cigarettes the litter fee. Physical responsibility, meaning they would have to set up an administration to manage this program of butt waste prevention. Whether it's cleaning up things, whether it's, taking back things, whether it's, whatever. That's what happens with EPR legislation. For instance, paint. When you don't use all your paint, what do you do with it? You don't dump it down the sewer. In California, we have something called a Paint Care Initiative. What happens is the industry pays a contractor to collect the paint and to dispose of it. The industry doesn't do it itself. It supports the program that does it. So I take my paint back to the paint store. The contractor picks it up. They recycle it or dispose of it and get rid of it. The industry pays for it. It's passed on to the consumer, of course, but it's a separately kind of done thing. And then the one up on top is liability that I've mentioned, which could be invoked in this. Another part of extended producer responsibility is product stewardship. And this is where the responsibility is not just from the producer, but the stewardship of the product goes all the way down through the distribution system to the user, to the community, for instance. And this is also done. And I think a good example of this is the computer and advanced recycling fee on computer products. That is, a fee is put on to the price of the computer, and the distributor has to collect that and then pick up the computer electronics and recycle them. So it gets, there's more complexity to this than we've experienced in the past. I want to mention this EU Single-Use Plastics Initiative. Again, this is a directive that was developed recently, and includes straws and plastic bags and all this stuff that we try to get rid of and don't need, but it excluded single-use plastic filters. Why? Well, because the tobacco industry didn't like it. Now, there's a principle that we all, I think, probably understand, is that if the tobacco industry doesn't like something, that's what we should do. If they like it, you should go in the other direction. And I think it's 100% reliable. So in this case, they say that that this ban on filters, this plastic filter ban, is not entirely workable. Well, that means that's what we should do if they don't like it. They also said that there's no alternative to cigarette filters that are as effective. So I have to ask the question, effective at what? Effective at marketing cigarettes. That's what they are. They're a marketing tool. They are not a health device. They do not protect people. They make it easier to smoke. They discourage people from quitting. And they're associated with an increased risk of adenocarcinoma, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And they've researched the alternatives, and none of them work. They don't match the performance of cellulose acetate. And if they make warnings, they may be in contrast with some of the other requirements of the Tobacco Products Directive. I don't need to go into that right now. They say that the EU Parliament's proposed consumption reduction targets, if they were applied to filtered cigarettes, would call for a ban on smoking. Now, maybe that's not so bad, ban on cigarettes. Most countries in the EU are also members of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is the world's first, and I think still only, health treaty, signed on by 168 countries, that requires countries to include tobacco control policies at several different levels. And there are environmental concerns that are expressed in the treaty. The U.S. is not a party to this treaty. Unfortunately, they never signed any treaties, and they don't obey them when they do sign it. So in this case, though, I think the countries that have signed on to this have a legal obligation to do whatever they can. So it seems consistent that whatever tobacco control kind of measures that would be implemented through this EU directive on plastics would also be, consistent with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control requirements. I'm going to skip this because I talked a little bit about it already. But banning filters, and this is the main measure that I think is doable. Cellulose acetate is a non-biodegradable plastic. It's poorly degradable. Under ideal circumstances, it can be gone away in 2 years into small particles that are broken down but still saturated with chemicals. They may become microplastics, in fact. It's designed to accumulate particles, but not many of the toxic chemicals that pass through to the smoker. They're not biodegradable, as I mentioned, and the biodegradable filters have not been marketable. And even if something were made that was a biodegradable filter, that would encourage smokers to flick it instead of deposit it someplace safely. So it didn't work. The history of filters is really interesting. They started happening in the 50s and 60s because of the tobacco scare, that is, the risks that were publicized by the Surgeon General's report, by the Royal College of Surgeons report, etc. And even governments got into the act of trying to make safer cigarettes, but they aren't safer. They never found anything that actually reduced the health risks. Now, they had reduced tar and nicotine, but that was measured by smoking machines and not by human kind of consumption measurements. And what happened is that even if you make a low tar, low nicotine cigarette, smokers compensate and they get the same amount of nicotine and tar that otherwise would be reduced. They can't even use the terms low tar and low nicotine now. I mean, it's impossible. It's regulated out because it's misleading. It misleads people into thinking that filters are safer. And e-cigarettes, I mean, now we have that as an issue to deal with the same principle that there's an attempt to make these things lower risk. And that's what the filter was meant to do. It didn't do it. The National Cancer Institute published a monograph in 2001 that said the design of cigarettes in the last 50 or 60 years hasn't done anything to reduce health consequences. The Surgeon General's report in 2014 said that there was evidence that the filter actually increased the risk of adenocarcinoma. Adenocarcinoma of the lung exists, or it comes about because of more deep inhalation against a filter. You have this obstruction. It makes it easier to suck the smoke deeper into the lungs, and that's where the adenocarcinoma arises. it's more aggressive than the small cell or other kinds of cell type carcinomas. And here's the graph that was published in a National Journal of the National Cancer Institute, showing that the age-adjusted incidence of adenocarcinoma is actually increased for both men and women, whereas the other kind of cancer cell types have decreased. That means it's a health risk, especially when you consider the fact that the filter makes it easier to smoke and discourages people from quitting. All those things together, to me, say that it should be banned. So I don't think it's a crazy idea. They have no benefit. They encourage people to start. And it's kind of like flavorings, you know. Flavorings make it easier for people to get addicted, so do filters. So couple that with the environmental concerns that they're non-biodegradable. Most butts are improperly discarded. They accumulate in aquatic environments. They degrade communities. And they make it toxicity studies in the lab. So anyway, that's why I don't think it's a crazy idea. I think it's just an idea whose time has not yet come. The industry is important to understand in this. I mentioned what they did and said about the EU plastic directive. Their answer is to educate smokers. You know how well that works. Pocket ashtrays. So you get a pocket ashtray, what do you do with it? You dump it someplace, whether it's in a landfill or, we've seen smokers take these pocket ashtrays to the beach and dump them in the parking lot or in the sewer where they go out into the environment. They sponsor anti-litter campaigns, and they do everything they can to avoid any kind of producer responsibility. So they're pretty good at this stuff, you know, and they call us brainwashed with environmental propaganda, which of course I am. They do a lot of corporate social responsibility, meaning they greenwash their efforts. They like to take pride in the fact that they've cleaned up their manufacturing processes. They fund environmental groups. Keep Sweden Tidy is funded by Philip Morris, and Keep America Beautiful is a subsidiary of Philip Morris. Why? Because that transfers responsibility downstream, makes it a focus on picking up butts instead of preventing their deposition in the environment. And so there's a lot of environmental groups that are funded by them, and it makes it difficult sometimes to bridge this gap with the environmental groups, but there are plenty that don't do it, like Greenpeace. I just started submitting a grant application to study the economic costs. In other words, I think, we understand the economic cost of healthcare when it's associated with cigarette use or tobacco use. We don't have a good sense of how environmental costs might be estimated, but it has been done for other kind of environmental contaminants. So I've started finding some economic modelers and other people that actually know what they're doing to try to put together a model to estimate what the economic cost of cigarette butt waste in the environment is on a country level basis. So we just got approved to send in this grant application, and hopefully in the next couple of years, or maybe a year, we'll be able to have a model to input data that then can estimate what cigarette costs are, tobacco environmental costs. And these are both direct, meaning things like pickup costs, but indirect, which are measurements of quality of life. And if we can cost that out, and maybe the human health effects, that I think will be important components. I mentioned San Francisco's law. I'm sorry I'm going on here, but I'm almost done. So this is interesting because I mentioned that they assessed this 20-cent pack litter fee. They did it based on a very careful estimation of what it costs to clean up the cigarette butts that are sold in the city. So they had several different components. There's a 50-page report. And they came up with this estimate of 22 cents. The city council passed a 20 cents litter fee. They got sued by the tobacco industry immediately, and surrogate groups sue them. But they overcame those lawsuits and in fact then raised the litter fee to 75 cents last year. That funds programs rather than just general taxes. So it's possible. Communities can do this. And I think that's where the action is, actually. My conclusions here are that TPW, tobacco product waste, is a mostly non-biodegradable toxic stuff. We need different kinds of approaches, disruptive approaches to get after it, and I think that's where banning the sale of filter cigarettes comes in. There's a big knowledge gap on that one, though. People still believe that filters are good for you. The tobacco industry and the retailers and other people along the supply chain should be brought into the product stewardship concept on this somehow. And then I think local action is where really it happens. That's what worked with smoke-free areas, indoor areas. It was local actions that actually built up to larger, national, international stuff, and then to frame messages that become important. Toxic butts. And then I ran into this guy in London last month who's out there trying to ban plastic poisons. And I mentioned cigarette butts to him. He says, oh yeah, that's next. We got to do that next. But again, it was excluded from the EU plastic directive, but not the other stuff that he's carrying around on his sign here. And then finally, getting the environmentalists involved. These are surfers against sewage in London, or in England rather. And they sacrificed their bodies for the cause here by getting out on this cold beach that they use for surfing and made the message that there shouldn't be any butts on the beach except theirs. So anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions now that you might have. Thanks.